Now, the Brics Summit kicks off in Brazil next week. Abdullah Verachia, faculty member at GIBS, joins us from our headquarters in Johannesburg to share his views. Abdullah, good morning. Lovely to have you as always. Now, we know that the Brics Bank, or the new development bank, is going to be top of the agenda in Fortaleza next week. But I want us to perhaps take a step back and ask the question, do we need another development bank?
I think, of course, if you trace back to March, April, May 2013 and the developments around Brazil and India, South Africa, China, and the discussions that they had at the Brics Summit in Durban last year, it was largely around how do we create an alternative development bank to be able to address some of the key and critical issues that we as emerging developing market economies face. And these are issues around infrastructure and the financing of infrastructure, the financing of agriculture projects. And so the Brics Development Bank is opportune, and the announcement that we'll see at Fortaleza next week will be significant, one, in terms of the size and the nature and the makeup of that bank, and then secondly also in terms of the headquarters of that bank. It looks likely that the bank will be headquartered in Shanghai. And secondly, it looks likely that we'll see equal contributions by all 5 member states towards the initial corpus funding of that Brics Development Bank. So I think, one, it's definitely a necessity to answer your question, and two, I think it will provide a very interesting construct to the global financial architecture as we see it. I think this initial construct and the initial capitalization of that bank is relatively small, but it definitely signals a new positioning amongst countries of the South. And especially, I think, realigns the global economic system as we see this development bank start getting meat and start looking at its mandate and some of the projects that it will finance in some of our economies.
Abdullah, if we look at the size of the economies, obviously South Africa being the smallest, do you think it makes sense for us to be contributing equally to the bank?
Well, I think there was a lot of discussion last year in Durban, and that's why it's taken so long to be able to get finality on this Brics Development Bank. And the discussion was centered around 3 or 4 critical areas. And finally, I think the members have reached consensus. I think the first one was really about, as you rightly say, how do we look at the relative economic strengths of the different economies. China today is the 2nd largest economy in the world, and soon to be perhaps the largest economy in the world. And how do you then compare the size and the relative scale of the Chinese economy vis-a-vis the South African economy? And there was a lot of discussion amongst the Brics member states in terms of the size of contribution of the member states. Eventually the consensus was that we should have equal member contributions, and I think it's always important when you have a makeup of a new bank like the Brics Development Bank to get it right at the onset, because as we go and as we move forward with the development bank and as it grows in size and stature, the importance of the initial member states that contributed to that fund will be important. And so I think South Africa wanted to, despite the fact that it's a sizable amount, wanted to have equal contributions because it will ensure that South Africa has equal participation at the table. What we've often seen, and this is a narrative that's been going on for the last 2-3 years, ever since China invited South Africa to be part of the Brics, has been a continued discussion around South Africa's deservedness to be part of the Brics. And I think we must move way beyond that. I think South Africa has demonstrated at the Brics Summit last year in Durban that it's an able and contributing player within the Brics dialogue and the discussion that we've had. And most importantly, I think the Brics Summit that we had in Durban was perhaps the most successful Brics Summit. And the reason I say that was the one thing that Durban did was it created institutional memory around the Brics. We had a contingency reserve arrangement that was put together. We had the Brics Business Council chaired by Patrice Motsepe. And so South Africa was very successful to punch above its weight in Durban last year and to really create some institutional structure around the Brics engagement.
Abdullah, I perhaps want to take you on the success of the chairmanship of South Africa, and in particular because the one opportunity that South Africa had was to bring Africa to Brics, and there were some moves in this regard around the Africa Pact. Now, should this continued engagement of African leaders not be championed by Brazil and the next country to take championship, can we still say that South Africa achieved anything for Africa with regards to the continent's relationship with the Brics group?
Sure, I'm happy you raised that. I think what's important is really to look at what happened last year and in the run-up between the 2013 and 2014 summit. Firstly, South Africa in a very unprecedented move that I've been told wasn't necessarily welcomed by many other BRICS countries, invited a number of other African countries to the BRICS Summit and their heads of state and finance and other ministers to the BRICS Summit in Durban. And they had an African leaders dialogue and retreat that was put together. And that was attended by all of the BRICS heads of state. And so it really utilized the opportunity to put Africa on the agenda. Secondly, in terms of the contingency reserve arrangement and the initial discussion around the financing of projects with the BRICS Development Bank, a lot of discussion was around how do we utilize that initial corpus that was put together to fund infrastructure, development and green energy projects specifically in Africa. So I think South Africa has been relatively successful in terms of putting Africa on the agenda. But I think we must be realistic. What's happened in Brazil at the moment is Brazil has also followed the cue from South Africa and has now also decided to invite a number of member states and neighboring countries within the Latin American region to participate in the summit next week. And so it's going to be interesting in terms of how the member states start engaging within their region. I think South Africa's role at the BRICS is twofold. One, South Africa was invited because of its critical positioning within the continent and how it utilizes that position to advance the interests of Africa. And secondly, as we all know, the BRICS countries, all four of them, and including South Africa, all five of them, have become key economic actors in Africa. China today is South Africa's largest trade partner. India plays an instrumental role here on the continent, and there are now over 100 Indian companies operating here in South Africa, and many of them quite influential players on the continent. And so Africa will continue to be part of the narrative of the BRICS, but I think we must be realistic in terms of the discussion areas that the BRICS would like to put on the agenda. They're many and they're varied. And I think this summit will be unprecedented in that it will be a new meeting of some heads of state. So India's new Prime Minister Narendra Modi will have his first multilateral engagement in Fortaleza next week. It will be very interesting to see this engagement between him and the Chinese president. It will also be an opportunity for new heads of state like the Indian Prime Ministers to start engaging within the region beyond just Brazil, but to engage with Argentina and many other countries. And so I think we're going to see...
I'm afraid that's where we have to leave it.
Sure.
Unfortunately for this morning, there was Abdullah Verachia, faculty member at GIBS, giving us his insight about the BRICS Summit that will be held in Brazil next week.